America's journey into space began, as all great national endeavors do, with a carefully balanced mix of genius, madness, and decisions no sane HR department would approve. If you imagine NASA's origins as a gleaming room full of stoic engineers with slide rules and buzz cuts, allow me to introduce you to the actual cast. A self-taught explosives expert who invoked pagan gods before a test firing. A British occultist so scandalous he was banned from his own country. A pre-Scientology swindler with a taste for other people's bank accounts. And a handful of Nazi rocket scientists the US smuggled in like they were carrying the cure for gravity. Welcome to the Complete Idiot's Guide to Rocket Science, Black Magic, and other NASA hiring policies. If this blend of thrust and theatre appeals to you, hit like and subscribe. Then drop a comment telling me your location and whether the moon is visible from your window right now. We'll need it for the ritual later. Buckle up, the candles are lit, the countdown's begun. To understand the glorious mess that birthed the US space program, you have to picture 1930s Pasadena. This was not the buttoned-down aerospace hub you're imagining. It was a place where artists, mystics, and pyromaniacs mingled freely, all under the polite cover of science clubs. Picture a neighborhood barbecue, except instead of hot dogs, people are cooking up rocket fuel in the garage, and the man across the street is wearing ceremonial robes because Saturn is in a favorable position. This was the playground of John Whiteside Jack Parsons, a man who could stand barefoot in the desert, stare at the stars, and calculate orbital mechanics in his head before turning to draw a summoning circle in the sand. Parsons did not see a contradiction here. Why wouldn't you combine chemistry and magic? After all, both involve a lot of dangerous powders, a willingness to blow yourself up, and an unwavering belief that you know what you're doing. The US Army, desperate for people who could make things explode in a controlled way, or at least in the same general area each time, decided to give Parsons and his friends more money than they know what to do with. This decision ranks just below, let's put a swimming pool on the Titanic, in the pantheon of risky ventures. But in fairness, these were the only people actually trying to build rockets in America at the time. Most respectable scientists considered rocketry about as credible as homeopathy, and considerably more likely to set your eyebrows on fire. So the Army ignored the red flags. The fact that Parsons read Aleister Crowley between chemistry experiments, the strange visitors who came to his home at all hours, the tendency for his test sites to look like post-apocalyptic art installations. What mattered was that the man could get a rocket off the ground, and in 1930s America, that was rarer than a sober senator. Pasadena's Caltech played an unwilling host to this madness. The administration tried to pretend this suicide squad, as Parsons' group was nicknamed, didn't exist, but it's hard to ignore students detonating experimental engines in the Arroyo Seco while dressed like extras from Metropolis. Their workspace was a strange hybrid, part laboratory, part occult den, part teenage clubhouse, with an unhealthy budget for explosives. It's easy to laugh now, but this chaotic brew of science and sorcery actually worked. They managed to produce functional solid fuel boosters at a time when most people still thought rockets were for cartoon coyotes. Parsons' group would eventually morph into the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Yes, that JPL, the crown jewel of American space exploration. And here's the part NASA never puts in their press kits. JPL's DNA includes incense smoke, chanting, and the occasional naked bonfire. The guys who made your Mars rovers possible learned their craft from a man who believed both Newton and Newton had equally important things to say about the cosmos. If NASA's family tree were drawn honestly, Jack Parsons would be the uncle everyone talks about in lowered voices at Thanksgiving. The one who once built a homemade flamethrower in the garage and accidentally burned down the shed, but also invented the recipe for the mashed potatoes you all still eat. Jack wasn't formally educated beyond high school, which in rocketry is a bit like saying your neurosurgeon learned from YouTube. But what he lacked in formal training, he more than made up for in reckless experimentation and a near-religious belief in his own destiny. Religious here being the operative word, because Parsons was as much priest as he was scientist, and he never saw a reason to separate the two job descriptions. To Parsons, a launch test was not merely a test, it was a rite. The preparation of fuel was a sacred act, the ignition a conjuring, the exhaust plume a message to both the heavens and any curious spirits who might be hanging around. Imagine if the Apollo 11 countdown had been conducted in Latin while everyone wore robes and you're halfway there. In his home laboratory, by which I mean a normal house filled with enough volatile chemicals to qualify as an arms depot, Parsons kept as many occult texts as he did engineering manuals. On one shelf, you might find experimental rocket propulsion systems. On the next, Magick in theory and practice. His casual blending of the two disciplines was not inspired by the occult. It was actually informed by it. The man genuinely believed that summoning the goddess Babylon might help his rocket tests succeed. And here's the wild part. Sometimes they did. Parsons often claimed that certain ritual dates and astrological alignments coincided with particularly successful tests. These were either incredible coincidences or the universe itself humouring him to see how far he'd take it. His fellow rocket experimenters, the so-called Suicide Squad, were a mixed bunch. Some tolerated his occult leanings as harmless eccentricity. Others quietly suspected the man might be onto something. After all, when you're working with liquid oxygen, powdered aluminum, and an ignition source, there's no doubt you're halfway to summoning something. Parsons was a card-carrying member of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the ceremonial magic organization then headed by Aleister Crowley, an eccentric so legendary he makes most rock stars look like they were raised in convents. The Pasadena chapter of the OTO met regularly at Parsons' mansion, known as the Parsonage, where they performed rituals that ranged from the mildly esoteric to the kind of thing you definitely wouldn't want your neighbours to see over the hedge. There were chants, incense, symbolic tools, and more than the occasional lack of clothing. And always Jack was at the centre, directing proceedings like a conductor whose orchestra was half brass section, half chemical plant. This is where Parsons blurred the line so thoroughly between science and magic that you couldn't tell whether you were attending a rocket demonstration or a scene from an avant-garde play. He would bless rocket components, anoint fuel mixtures, and occasionally time the launch countdown to coincide with ritual invocations and other debauchery. You might think the military would have a problem with this, but as long as the rockets kept flying and the enemy's fortifications kept crumbling, they didn't care if Jack summoned the ghost of Aristotle to push the ignition button. It's one thing to dabble in a little light mysticism. It's quite another to become the star pupil of Aleister Crowley. The two men corresponded frequently, their letters full of equal parts reverence, technical curiosity, and the sort of sentences you have to read 3 times to decide if they're poetry, madness, or both. Crowley referred to Parsons as the most important of my American disciples, and encouraged him to merge his scientific work with magical practice. This was like giving a pyromaniac permission to work in a fireworks factory. Under Crowley's influence, Parsons took his rituals more seriously, more theatrically, and, perhaps most alarmingly, more publicly. The Pasadena OTO gatherings became infamous in certain circles. Guests might find themselves discussing orbital velocity one moment and chanting invocations to Egyptian deities the next. Occasionally these gatherings bled into actual rocket test days, and more than one visiting military officer left wondering if they'd just witnessed science, sorcery, or an incredibly elaborate prank. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Parsons's fusion of the mystical and the mechanical seemed to give him an edge. His work on jet-assisted takeoff JATO rockets revolutionized aircraft performance during World War II. Planes burdened with heavy loads could now get airborne in shorter distances, thanks in large part to the fuel mixtures and ignition systems he'd helped develop, between rituals, of course. And JPL, the direct descendant of the Suicide Squad, would go on to become one of the most prestigious space research institutions in the world. But in those early days, its roots were sunk deep into soil, fertilized by incense ash and burnt oxidizers. Parsons believed that by invoking deities, channeling energies, and aligning his work with celestial cycles, he could literally draw down power into his projects. Whether or not you buy into that, you can't deny that the man's results spoke for themselves. The paradox of Parsons is that his approach was as unscientific as it gets, and yet it produced scientifically measurable success. Of course, the thing about this kind of lifestyle is that it's only sustainable if everything keeps going up, literally and figuratively. And when your personal life resembles a pulp novel involving espionage, secret orders, and betrayals, something is eventually going to blow up that isn't a rocket. Parsons was about to meet L. Ron Hubbard, a man whose personal ambition made Parsons' magical aspirations look quaint. Hubbard's arrival would mark the beginning of an even stranger chapter in the saga, one involving stolen yachts, moonchild prophecies, and the kind of friendship that only ends when one party sails away with the other's girlfriend. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, remember Jack Parsons as the man who looked at the stars and decided to reach them not just with mathematics, but with magic, and almost pulled it off. It is a truth universally acknowledged that if you have a mansion, a laboratory, a free bar, disregard for conventional morality, L. Ron Hubbard will eventually show up at your door. In the early 1940s, Hubbard was still years away from inventing Scientology, but he had already perfected his core competencies, looking confident in a captain's hat, telling stories with a dangerously high ratio of fiction to fact, and extracting money from people who should have known better. By the time Hubbard met Jack Parsons, he had left behind a trail of broken friendships, unpaid bills, and women who remembered him with the kind of fondness usually reserved for dental surgery. His resume, such as it was, included pulp fiction writing, a brief and disputed naval career, and an uncanny knack for ingratiating himself with exactly the sort of people who would later regret meeting him. Jack Parsons, being a man of boundless curiosity and questionable radar for grifters, welcomed Hubbard into his circle with open arms. And to be fair, Hubbard made a hell of a first impression. He was charming, funny, and could spin a yarn so compelling you'd forget to check whether any of it was true. He was also, much like Parsons, a man who could talk at length about cosmic destinies and extraterrestrial beings without flinching in the least. Parsons had already been deep into Aleister Crowley's Thelema philosophy, which held, among other things, that one could summon spiritual entities and channel their influence into the material world. With Hubbard's arrival, the idea gained a new twist. Parsons became convinced they could conduct a ritual dubbed the Babylon Working to summon an otherworldly female entity, a sort of divine muse who would help usher in a new age of enlightened humanity, or, depending on your perspective, a supernatural girlfriend. Now, reasonable people might pause at this point and say, "Jack, maybe focus on the rockets." But reasonable people were not invited to these gatherings. The ritual was as elaborate as it was bizarre. Days of chanting, symbolic tools, incense thick enough to qualify as atmospheric interference, and the precise timing of events according to astrological charts. Parsons played the high priest, Hubbard the scribe and assistant. The goal was nothing less than to create a moonchild, a being of extraordinary power destined to change the course of history. If you've ever wondered how close the American space program came to being co-designed by the protagonist of Raiders of the Lost Ark and the villain from Moulin Rouge, this is your answer. For a while, Hubbard played his role to perfection. He and Parsons became inseparable, conducting rituals, discussing metaphysics, and occasionally dabbling in less supernatural ventures. Parsons even trusted Hubbard enough to involve him in a business deal. Always a mistake when one party thinks fiduciary responsibility is an optional side quest. The plan was simple. They would buy yachts on the East Coast, sail them to California, and sell them at a profit. If you're thinking this sounds like a legitimate business, you've never met Hubbard. Somewhere between acquisition and sale, Hubbard sailed off with one of the yachts, taking with him Parsons's investment money and Parsons' girlfriend, Sarah Northrup. It was the kind of double betrayal that would make a soap opera writer say, "Steady on, that's a bit much." Parsons, realizing he had been had, attempted to track them down. This culminated in him performing an actual magical ritual to try and bring them back, which, in the grand tradition of magical rituals aimed at specific individuals, failed entirely. Hubbard and Sarah were already far away, probably laughing, definitely not returning the money. Aleister Crowley, still pulling strings from England, was unimpressed. In letters to his American associates, Crowley referred to Hubbard as a con man and expressed disbelief that Parsons had fallen for him. This was rich coming from a man who had spent his life convincing people to fund his mystical adventures. But even the great beast knew when a grifter was working on his home turf. Crowley's verdict was swift. Parsons had been robbed and made a fool of, which was accurate. He was also warned, in no uncertain terms, to stop associating with Hubbard. Parsons, however, had a high tolerance for both personal chaos and sunk costs, and the damage was already done. You will not find a NASA webpage detailing the Babylon Working or the yacht affair. This is partly because it has nothing to do with actual aerospace engineering, and partly because it has everything to do with the kind of people who founded parts of NASA. The sanitized version of events leaves out the bit where one of America's pioneering rocket scientists got taken to the cleaners by a man who would later invent a religion involving intergalactic warlords, and who claimed, quite casually, to be working on behalf of Al-Masih ad-Dajjal, the figure Islamic eschatology describes as the Antichrist, after the latter allegedly popped into one of his dreams for a quick career chat. This omission is understandable. After all, NASA likes its history to read like a triumph of science and ingenuity, not a deleted subplot from a season of Archer. But if you trace the institutional DNA of America's space program, you'll find this weird detour lurking in the genome, like a recessive gene for spontaneous interpretive dance. After the yacht incident, Parsons threw himself back into his scientific work. He was no longer officially welcome at JPL, thanks to a combination of security clearances, gossip, and a growing discomfort with his extracurriculars. But his contributions to rocket propulsion continued in other ways: consulting, research, and writing papers that managed to be both technically sound and sprinkled with metaphysical musings. His personal life, however, never regained anything resembling stability. The loss of his girlfriend and a large chunk of his fortune to Hubbard was a blow he never entirely recovered from. Yet in true Parsons fashion, he didn't renounce the occult. If anything, he leaned further into it, convinced that the worlds of science and magic could and should remain intertwined. There's a certain tragicomedy to Parsons at this point in his life. Here was a man whose work had literally helped launch the space age, and yet he couldn't launch a stable relationship or a profitable business without it ending in betrayal, scandal, or an FBI file thick enough to use as a booster seat. It's tempting to view the Hubbard episode as just a quirky footnote in NASA history, but it's more than that. It's emblematic of the freewheeling, anything-goes atmosphere of early rocketry. These were not men and women working in sterile labs with strict hierarchies. They were tinkerers, dreamers, and in some cases, outright lunatics. They took risks in their personal lives that matched the risks they took in their professional ones. Parsons' openness to Hubbard wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system. The same lack of caution that let him experiment with dangerous fuels also let him welcome a man like Hubbard into his life without checking references. The result was inevitable, a combustible mixture that eventually exploded. Only this time the detonation was metaphorical, and yet there's a strange poetic symmetry here. Hubbard went on to found a movement that would send its own kind of rockets into the cultural atmosphere. Rockets made of dogma, lawsuits, and celebrity endorsements. Parsons, for his part, continued to chase literal rockets, as if determined to prove that at least one of them would land where he intended. Hubbard's exit from Parsons's life left a vacuum, metaphorically, emotionally, and financially. Into that vacuum stepped another set of unlikely collaborators, the former enemies of World War II, smuggled into America under Operation Paperclip. They brought with them not just advanced rocket designs, but a moral grey area large enough to park a lunar module in. World War II was barely over when the United States government faced a delicate moral question. Should we, a freedom-loving democracy, hire some of the Third Reich's top scientists, many of whom are, how to put this gently, up to their epaulets in war crimes? After about 2 seconds of pretending to think about it, the answer was yes, and make sure they bring their blueprints. This initiative was given the blandly harmless name Operation Paperclip, which sounds like a stationery supply request, but was actually a program to smuggle more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians into the US. The paperclip part referred to the actual paperclips used to attach sanitized cover sheets over the scientists' Nazi-filled personnel files, thus ensuring their new resumes read more like rocket enthusiast and less like enthusiast for bombing London. It was, in essence, the largest morally questionable recruitment drive in history. At the center of this morally elastic operation was Werner von Braun, the wunderkind of Nazi rocketry. Von Braun had built the V-2 rocket, a technological marvel if you were an engineer, a technological nightmare if you happened to live in one of the cities it landed on. Von Braun was not just a brilliant engineer, he was also a master of survival. As Germany collapsed, he quickly repositioned himself from "I am developing advanced missiles for Hitler" to "I have always been deeply passionate about peaceful space exploration and also apple pie." In his own words, he wanted to build rockets to go to the moon. He just got sidetracked working for a genocidal dictatorship because that's where the funding was. You know, as one does. The US government, ever pragmatic, looked at von Braun and saw not the SS uniform, not the slave labour camps at Peenemünde, but the potential for a really fast missile to beat the Soviets. The moral ledger was adjusted accordingly. War crimes, yes, but have you seen his trajectory calculations? And so, the strangest fourth office culture in history began to form. On one side, German engineers with impeccable technical skills, accents thick enough to cut with a bread knife, and a past you didn't ask about if you wanted to keep your lunch down. On the other, Californian rocket men who believed in summoning Babylonian goddesses before test firings. Picture the first day at work. The ex-Nazi engineers arrive, neatly dressed, carrying technical drawings of ballistic missiles. The JPL veterans stroll in late, wearing desert dust, smelling faintly of incense, and discussing whether Mars has its own guardian spirits. HR, if it existed in any meaningful form in the 1940s, looks at the seating chart and quietly calls for a drink. In theory, they were all there for the same goal: advance America's rocketry program. In practice, it was like merging the cast of Das Boot with Burning Man. To understand the rush, you have to remember that the Cold War was starting, and the Soviet Union was making the US extremely nervous. If America didn't hire these German scientists, the Soviets would, and the thought of Moscow putting a man on the moon first was about as appealing to Washington as a tax audit conducted by Joseph Stalin. So the logic went, hire the Germans, pretend they were never Nazis, get to space before the Russians. Hope nobody asks too many questions about Step 2. The public, for its part, was largely kept in the dark. If there's one thing governments excel at, it's distracting citizens with parades while they quietly import a few dozen former members of the SS into Alabama. The ex-Nazi rocket team was relocated to Huntsville, Alabama, a town that up to that point had been better known for its cotton mills than its space program. Overnight, the place transformed into Rocket City. Local diners learned to serve schnitzel. The beer supply mysteriously improved, and suddenly you could overhear conversations about escape velocity at the grocery store. Von Braun, ever the diplomat, became a beloved figure in the community. He joined local clubs, attended church, and gave lectures about space exploration that made people forget, if only for the duration of the speech, that he had once built weapons for Hitler. The man could charm the pants off anyone, which was fortunate, because his past required a level of charm just short of hypnotism. When NASA was officially formed in 1958, von Braun and his team were already indispensable. The Saturn V rocket that took Apollo astronauts to the moon bore von Braun's fingerprints. Metaphorically, of course, though given his hands-on approach, possibly literally. In the official NASA narrative, the contributions of these German engineers are highlighted for their brilliance and downplayed for their, shall we say, extracurricular activities during the 1940s. You won't find built rockets for a fascist regime on any of the official biographies. It's more along the lines of pioneer in astronautics and advocate for space exploration, which is technically true if you squint hard enough and drink. It's easy to imagine the coffee breaks at early NASA and JPL, von Braun, discussing the efficiency of liquid-fueled stages. A JPL veteran explaining that the last test firing went well because they performed it under a waxing moon. Someone in the back, probably from the Air Force, wondering if they'd accidentally walked into the wrong meeting. The Germans brought precision, discipline, and a slight air of, let's not talk about 1943. The Americans brought creativity, chaos, and a tendency to start sentences with, what if we just... Both sides found the other baffling, but together they produced results. Rockets flew higher, faster, and more reliably, sometimes even in the intended direction. Ethics in the rearview mirror. Looking back, Operation Paperclip raises questions that remain uncomfortable to this day. Was it worth it? Did the ends justify the means? Could America have reached the moon without importing scientists whose resumes read like exhibits in a war crimes trial? The official answer tends to be a variation of, we won the space race, didn't we? Which is a bit like saying, yes, the cake tastes great, let's not talk about the arsenic in the flour. Critics argue that by whitewashing these men's pasts, the US set a dangerous precedent, namely, that extraordinary technical skill can buy absolution. Supporters counter that the Cold War was an existential crisis, and in such times you take your geniuses where you can find them, even if they come with baggage the size of Bavaria. How Parsons would have fit in if he had. By this point, Parsons was largely out of the official loop. His security clearances were gone, his reputation was a cautionary tale, and his social calendar was heavy on occult gatherings and light on government contracts. But you can't help imagining what it would have been like if he had ended up in Huntsville alongside von Braun. Picture the scene. Parsons leading a full moon ritual in the parking lot, von Braun nodding politely before heading back inside to check fuel mixture ratios, and the janitor wondering when exactly this became his life. It's probably for the best that the two worlds, while connected through the larger web of American rocketry, remained somewhat separate. Mixing Parsons's mystical fervour with the Germans' precise engineering might have produced either the most advanced spacecraft in history or an interplanetary disaster. Operation Paperclip succeeded in its primary aim. America beat the Soviets to the moon. Whether that victory came at a moral cost too high to justify is still debated, but there's no debate about this. The DNA of NASA contains strands from both a Californian magician chemist and a cadre of German rocket scientists with suspiciously redacted resumes. Next, we return to Pasadena to see how the post-Parsons JPL evolved. How a lab once fueled by equal parts nitroglycerin and incense transitioned into a polished government institution. Spoiler, they didn't get all the incense out of the carpet. If you walk into JPL today, you'll find pristine hallways, engineers in NASA polos, and conference rooms named after planets. Everything gleams. It smells faintly of new carpet and institutional coffee. Visitors are politely ushered past glass walls into visitor centers where scale models of spacecraft are displayed under spotlights. What you will not find, unless you pry up the metaphorical floorboards, is the ghost of its original personality, a barely contained circus of geniuses, misfits, and people who thought flammable was just another word for fun. By the time Jack Parsons was out of the picture, the Suicide Squad had lost its chaos conductor. But chaos doesn't vanish, it just finds new ways to manifest. The early 1950s JPL was a place where a conversation about valve tolerances could seamlessly segue into a debate about whether the moon landing should be televised or kept classified in case of alien photobombing. Without Parsons, there were fewer occult symbols drawn on the chalkboards. But the spirit of rule-bending persisted. Many of the old-timers still approached engineering with the attitude of, "What's the worst that could happen?" A question that, in rocketry, has only one answer: everything. The government, now with its fingers deeper in JPL's pie, began a slow and painful process of civilizing the place. This meant more meetings, more paperwork, and an influx of what the original crew would have called people who tuck their shirts in. Testing protocols were tightened. Safety regulations were implemented. The term acceptable risk was replaced with risk assessment forms in triplicate. JPL scientists, who once lit fuses with cigarettes dangling from their mouths, now had to sit through presentations on fire safety given by men who'd never actually seen something explode outside a training video. For the veterans, it was like being told the circus would now be run by accountants. In the Parsons era, JPL was the kind of place where a bad day meant losing a rocket to an unexpected side detonation. By the mid-50s, a bad day meant someone had used the wrong font in a memo. That's not to say JPL lost all its flavour. Beneath the surface, there was still a streak of rebellious ingenuity. Some engineers kept small shrines to their favourite projects hidden in desk drawers. Others quietly maintained the tradition of unofficial experiments, conducted after hours in locked labs with equipment borrowed, temporarily, from official projects. It was these after-hours experiments that sometimes produced the real breakthroughs, a fact that the management conveniently forgot whenever those breakthroughs won awards. Thanks to Operation Paperclip, a few of the ex-Nazi engineers found themselves rubbing shoulders with the JPL crowd. This was not always a smooth integration. The Germans valued precision, order, and detailed plans. The JPL veterans valued improvisation, intuition, and the ability to make a fuel pump out of spare parts and optimism. One anecdote from the era has a German engineer presenting a meticulously detailed launch plan, only to have a JPL old-timer glance at it, nod and say, "Looks good, but what if we just tried it right now?" The German was horrified. The JPL guy was halfway to the test site before the sentence ended. Somehow, the marriage of order and chaos worked. The Germans taught the Americans about long-term planning. The Americans taught the Germans that sometimes the shortest path to success was a well-timed gamble. The resulting projects were both better engineered and more adventurous than either group could have produced alone. When NASA absorbed JPL in 1958, the culture shift accelerated. The newly formed space agency had its eyes on the prize, beating the Soviets to every possible milestone, and JPL became one of its crown jewels. This meant more funding, more prestige, and more people whose job titles included the word compliance. The public image of JPL was scrubbed clean. Gone were the stories of improvised rocket tests and questionable safety practices. In their place, press releases filled with phrases like innovative research and rigorous scientific method. No one mentioned that rigorous sometimes meant we tried it 3 times before it stopped exploding. Even in its polished NASA form, JPL remained a place where the physical spaces told stories. The labs were crammed with equipment ranging from cutting-edge electronics to tools older than the engineers using them. Walls were lined with schematics, whiteboards covered in equations, and the occasional cryptic doodle that could be either an orbital path or a cartoon cat. It was hard to tell without asking. Some rooms had scorch marks on the floors that no one could explain, or at least no one was willing to explain in writing. Old test stands sat like monuments to past projects, their metal surfaces etched with the scars of repeated abuse. If you listened carefully during a tour, you might hear a veteran quietly reminiscing about the time they accidentally tested a booster indoors. A surprising number of Parsons' contemporaries managed to adapt to the new order. They swapped leather jackets for lab coats, traded beer-fueled brainstorming sessions for scheduled team meetings, and learned to keep their wilder ideas off the official record. But they didn't forget. Every now and then, when the right group found themselves alone, they'd slip into old habits, pushing the limits of what was allowed, sometimes literally. A particularly persistent rumour from the late 50s claims that one team tested a small rocket motor in the parking lot after hours, just to see if they could. The scorch mark allegedly remained until the asphalt was replaced years later. Despite the bureaucracy, JPL continued to deliver results. The combination of disciplined project management and the lingering spirit of fearless experimentation proved potent. JPL's transformation from Parsons' Chaos Lab to NASA's polished research center was complete by the early 60s. But the DNA of the place, the willingness to try, fail, and try again with only a vague regard for the rules, was still there, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And while JPL was busy putting on its best government-issue face, Parsons himself was entering the final, most mysterious chapter of his life. A chapter that would end with an explosion in his home lab, a flurry of conspiracy theories, and a legacy equal parts triumph and tragedy. If Jack Parsons' life was a rocket, then his final chapter was the moment where the engine sputters, spins out of control, and explodes spectacularly in a shower of burning fragments, only with more linoleum involved. By the early 1950s, Parsons was out of the official rocketry game. The government had stripped him of his security clearance, politely declined his services, and probably added a sticky note to his FBI file reading, "Do not let near classified anything, especially explosives." But Jack was not the sort of man to fade quietly into a suburban retirement. No, he had two settings: full thrust or spontaneous combustion, which brings us to June 17th, 1952, Pasadena. The kitchen of Jack Parsons' home laboratory, a phrase that should already be giving you pause. Because if you have to add laboratory after home to explain why your kitchen contains nitric acid, mercury, and enough fulminate of mercury to make the neighbor's teeth rattle, you are not living a lifestyle that will see you into your golden years. According to the official police report, Parsons was mixing chemicals for a movie special effects job. Yes, Hollywood occasionally hired the man who tried to summon an interdimensional goddess to do their pyrotechnics. When an explosion ripped through the room, he suffered catastrophic injuries, including the loss of a limb, and died shortly thereafter. It's the sort of tragic ending that would make sense for a man whose hobbies included juggling volatile chemicals and running with scissors, except the scissors were made of uranium. But as with everything in Parsons' life, the official story is only the starting point. Almost immediately, alternative theories began to swirl. Some said it was suicide, Parsons, despondent over his career collapse, deciding to go out in a blaze of glory. Others insisted it was an accident, pure and simple, the inevitable result of decades spent handling chemicals with the same safety precautions most people use when making a sandwich. And then there were the juicier theories, that Parsons had been assassinated by government agents, worried he might sell rocket secrets to foreign powers, that the occult rituals had finally backfired in a literal sense. That the explosion had been a cover for his faked death, and Jack was now living under an assumed name in Mexico, perhaps still tinkering with rockets between margaritas. The last theory was helped along by the fact that Parsons had reportedly been packing for a trip to Mexico at the time of the explosion. You have to admit, it's a convenient itinerary change. Step 1, blow up kitchen. Step 2, disappear forever. Crowley's protégé, Hollywood's problem. Adding to the intrigue was Parsons's enduring connection to the occult world. Even in his final years, he was still an active practitioner of Thelema, still holding rituals, still corresponding with fellow magicians. For the devoutly mundane, this was reason enough to suspect dark forces had a hand in his demise. It also didn't help that Parsons's clientele in his pyrotechnics work included Hollywood studios, meaning his circle now overlapped with actors, stuntmen, and producers who thrived on drama and wouldn't recognize a plausible explanation if it knocked on their dressing room door. The film industry knew a good story when it saw one, and Parsons's death had all the elements. By this point, Parsons wasn't just a man, he was a myth in circulation. Stories about him had been embellished, exaggerated, and outright fabricated to the point where reality and fiction were about as easy to separate as two beakers of the same transparent liquid. One persistent rumour claimed the explosion happened because Parsons was attempting to create homunculi, tiny magical beings, inside pressure vessels. The science on this is of course non-existent, but it's exactly the sort of idea people were willing to believe about him. Another rumour had it that he'd been in contact with entities who didn't appreciate his latest experiment. Still another suggested a mob connection, because why not? At this point, adding organised crime to the Parsons narrative was like tossing one more cherry on a collapsing sundae. Unsurprisingly, NASA has never devoted much time to discussing the kitchen explosion of their unofficial spiritual founder. In their retellings, Parsons' story tends to fade out around the point where he moved on to private work, as if he retired to a peaceful life of gardening and bridge club meetings. There is no official NASA pamphlet titled "The Day Jack Parsons Blew Himself to Kingdom Come Over the Stove." This is partly PR damage control, partly the fact that Parsons's latter years are hard to frame as a noble coder. It's difficult to end a biography with, "and then he exploded in his kitchen," without changing the tone dramatically. In the decades since his death, Parsons has acquired a strange sort of cult following. To some, he's a tragic genius, a man who pushed the boundaries of science and mysticism until they snapped back on him. To others, he's a cautionary tale about what happens when you mix volatile chemicals with volatile ideas. Occultists still revere him for his thelemic work, even citing the Babylon working as a pivotal spiritual event. Rocket enthusiasts admire his technical achievements, crediting him as a visionary who helped lay the groundwork for modern spaceflight. And conspiracy theorists, of course, see in his death the fingerprints of shadowy forces, be they government, magical, or extraterrestrial. In a way, Parsons's kitchen lab was a perfect metaphor for his life. It was a space where the ordinary and the extraordinary collided daily. Mundane appliances beside glassware of dangerous liquids, a refrigerator sharing space with a rack of high explosives. Just as in his career, the domestic and the dangerous existed side by side until, inevitably, one overwhelmed the other. And perhaps that's why his death still fascinates. It wasn't just that a brilliant man died young, It was that he died exactly the way you'd expect Jack Parsons to die, in an explosion of his own making, surrounded by the tools and toys of a life spent straddling the line between the possible and the insane. It's tempting to wonder what Parsons could have accomplished had he lived longer. Would he have rehabilitated his career, returned to the mainstream of aerospace research, or would he have gone deeper into the occult, eventually merging the two into something unrecognizable but spectacular? There's a parallel universe somewhere in which Parsons lived into the 1970s, hosted a late-night talk show about rockets and rituals, and made guest appearances on The Tonight Show, where Johnny Carson nervously laughed as Jack lit a small booster motor on stage. But in this universe, his story ends in Pasadena, with a bang instead of a whimper. Jack Parsons left behind no children, but plenty of progeny in the form of ideas, institutions, and an enduring question mark over where exactly genius ends and madness begins. His fingerprints are still on every rocket launch, every JPL mission, every Mars rover that trundles across the red dust, faint but undeniable. From here, the story shifts back to NASA itself, an organization now sanitized, streamlined, and publicly respectable, yet still carrying in its DNA the chaotic impulses of its earliest contributors. As America moved into the space age, the official history left out the bonfires, the rituals, and the kitchen explosions. But the people who were there remembered, and sometimes, late at night, over a drink, they'd tell you about the magician who taught them to reach the stars. The downside of editing history is that you lose some of its richness. The real story of NASA's birth is messier, stranger, and far more human than the official narrative. It's a story of brilliant misfits, improbable alliances, moral compromises, and the occasional goat sacrifice. By sanding down the rough edges, NASA created a myth that was easier to sell but less interesting to tell. Which is why, even today, the unabridged version circulates in the shadows. Told by old engineers in bars, whispered among occultists, and occasionally resurrected in satirical podcasts. NASA's official story may have been a triumph of image management, but the truth was still out there, embedded in the memories of those who had been there from the start. And as the 1960s space race kicked into high gear, the tension between the polished myth and the messy reality only grew sharper. So here, at the end of our guided tour through NASA's untidy attic, let's give each of the key players their curtain call. Jack Parsons, the magician scientist who thought the best way to make a rocket fly was to invite the gods to watch, went out with a bang, literally, and left behind a propulsion legacy still in use today. Aleister Crowley never built a rocket, but somehow managed to leave his fingerprints on the blueprints. Proof that you can influence history from a chaise lounge an ocean away. L. Ron Hubbard, briefly involved, absconded with money and a girlfriend, went on to create a religion featuring galactic tyrants and volcanoes. Probably the only man in history for whom rocket science was the least controversial part of his career. Wernher von Braun designed humanity's most famous moon rocket after previously designing missiles for a regime history agreed to remember only selectively. In the end, the American space program was never just about escaping Earth's gravity. It was about escaping the gravity of ordinary thinking. And to do that, you need more than fuel. You need faith, whether in science, in magic, or in the unshakable belief that somewhere out there, just past the reach of your equations, is the next great leap waiting for you to light the fuse.